Hello, and welcome once again to the Justin Center podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Once again, I want to give you a quick reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. So if you've benefited from the work that we do and would like to see it continue, go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page and help us out there. Another reminder, Justin Center is an organization that does all sorts of things. We don't just have this YouTube channel that I host. We have a publishing house. We put out all sorts of great theological works, and you can check those out at justincenter.org as well. We have some really great new texts that are coming up very soon. Check out our recent release of Ernst Sartorius' Doctrine of Divine Love, which is one of the great works of 19th century ethics and theology. Again, go to justincenter.org, or you can just look it up on Amazon, Ernst Sartorius' Doctrine of Divine Love. Okay, well, today on the program, I'm going to be doing a talk that people have asked me to do for a while now. And as you probably know, if you're a regular watcher or listener, that I don't focus so much on response videos, but people always want me to do response videos. And so that means that I do them some, and I do them when people ask me to do that. Now, this particular response video I was asked to do by a number of different people while I was in the middle of my move. I'm in my new office here, but so I wasn't able to watch the video people wanted me to respond to, which was a video from Dr. Gavin Ortlund on the subject of infant baptism and the history of baptizing infants in the church. So I wasn't able to watch it when it first came out. Now I have had the chance to watch it, and so I'm going to do a response here. Now, just quickly want to say this. I've done all these responses to Gavin Ortlund on a number of issues because people have asked me to. And so some of those have been, we had a dialogue on baptism or debate on baptism, which is on 3 different channels. We have videos up discussing baptism from a few years ago now. Then I recently did a response in a few parts to his video on Lutheran Christology. Now, it seems kind of odd that every time I address Dr. Ortlund, it's something that I disagree with him on, and I'm like critiquing him, because the reality is I agree with him far more than I disagree with him, and I like him quite a bit as a person and his channel as well. So it feels a bit weird to constantly be responding to him, but it's because he is one of the few voices on this platform that actually publishes scholarly articles, somebody who really actually is well-read in literature on these issues, that I think he's worth responding to much more than probably most people on the platform of YouTube. So this is another opportunity for me to really dive deep into an issue that I care about a lot, and that is infant baptism. So I've put together a PowerPoint here. Now, most of what I'm actually doing in this video is not going to be just a direct refutation of Dr. Ortlund's points. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm taking a different tactic to this. So I'm not going to be playing clips of his video. What I'm going to do is present the evidence as I see it that defends the practice of infant baptism as an early Christian practice. And so in doing this, I am largely summarizing arguments from other people. And mostly, I'm summarizing arguments from Joachim Jeremias, and talk a little about the history of this debate and kind of what led to the publication of these, at least the second of these 2 books here. But Jeremias has 2 books on the subject of infant baptism in the early church. So the first of these was Infant Baptism in the First 4 Centuries. The second is The Origins of Infant Baptism, a further study in reply to Kurt Aland. These 2 books are both pretty small. They're republished by Wittgenstock. They're older texts, but still I think very worthwhile. And I think that the arguments that he puts in here still really hold up pretty well. Though, of course, there have been certainly responses to the arguments that he's made. So what I'm going to be doing is presenting the evidence that Jeremias sets forth here. And so this doesn't mean you shouldn't read the books yourself if you'd like to dive into this issue some more, but I'll summarize a lot of the kind of primary points here. Now, I'm not going to get to everything. That's an impossibility in an hour talk here. I could probably do 10 hours of this. I don't know if you want me to do that, but at least in this part, I'm going to discuss the New Testament evidence, or the arguments or evidence for infant baptism as a practice in the time of the New Testament. So I'm not going to be delving into 2nd century and early 3rd century sources in this video. If you want me to, let me know, and I will continue and do that as well. I could dive pretty deep into these sources, and like I said, I could spend a very long time doing this, but I'm going to try to be concise as much as I possibly can be. All right, and so the history of the debate. Now, there is a lot of difficulty in trying to discern what Christian practices were in the 3rd century, or even really in the 1st century outside of the New Testament itself. The fact is that once we get to the 3rd and especially the 4th century, we have a lot of theological texts. We have a lot more that's written. We have a lot more treatises. And so it's much easier for us to piece together in the 4th century onward what early Christian worship looked like. But there is a real lack of sources when we're talking 2nd century. There are a couple of them that are really well known. We can look at people like Irenaeus or Justin Martyr. And they do speak some, especially Justin Martyr has some about what happened at early Christian worship, but they don't really discuss the question of infant baptism at all in any depth. So it's pretty difficult to find evidence of either credo baptism or pedo baptism in that era, at least explicitly. And so this is largely the reason for the extensive amount of debate over this particular era, because once we get to the 3rd century, we have a lot more clarity on what's going on here. So it is difficult to make an incontrovertible claim regarding the baptism of infants during this particular time period. Now, 19th century scholarship and then early 20th century scholarship often argued that infant baptism arose in the second half of the 2nd century and that we don't have any evidence for it prior to that. That's the claim that Dr. Ortlund is going to make. And so this was a very popular view. Jeremias kind of turned scholarship in the other direction, and now scholarship has kind of maybe moved somewhat back to the direction before this, especially with the work of Everett Ferguson. However, I still find Jeremias' arguments the most compelling. Okay, so this scholarship in that particular time period, late 19th, early 20th century, generally tried to figure out what the practice of infant baptism was, or the age of baptism was in the 2nd century, kind of working backwards. And that means they start with Tertullian. Now, Tertullian wrote this very well-known treatise on baptism, where he argued against the practice of infant baptism, which shows us that infant baptism was being practiced, but that there were some opponents of the practice. And so a lot of scholarship, because of the kind of lack of clarity prior to that era, began with Tertullian and tried to reason backward to say, okay, what was going on that Tertullian was responding to? What was the general situation in the church? Albrecht Ebke argued, and that's the individual in the picture here, not a very well-known scholar, at least not in an American context, and his work is in German, but he's one that Jeremias cites here. He argues that both the Jewish environment via circumcision, meaning that there is a particular Jewish theology of circumcision or belief about circumcision that's present in the Old Testament, and then within Judaism following that circumcision, the sign of the covenant, was given to infants on the 8th day. That's what was clearly commanded in the Old Testament. And so oftentimes when we look at arguments for infant baptism, people are going to set infant baptism within the context of circumcision for infants, to say, well, we have to understand the 1st century church coming out of its Jewish roots as one that had a particular way of viewing the family, had a particular way of viewing children, in viewing the relationship between the faith of the parents and the children and God's covenant with children. But Ebke is going to argue that not only does the Jewish context lead toward a view of infant baptism because of circumcision, and not just circumcision, but also he says that, well, the Hellenistic context does the same thing. In other words, within the ancient Roman world, children were involved within the mysteries, these kind of mystery religions throughout the Roman Empire. And so what he's saying is that there was an entire milieu of religious practice, cultic practice within the Greco-Roman world as well as within the Jewish world that both included this incorporation of infants or children within the religion. And so it's important to read the New Testament in the context that it was written in and the context of who those early readers may have been and what they were used to in terms of religious practices, or how to identify religion with a family or with children as related to the parents. And so from the 1920s onward, scholarship began to move much more toward an openness to infant baptism as a New Testament practice that would have likely continued into the 2nd century rather than some late 2nd century novelty that arose out of any particular circumstance. Now, the argument that Dr. Ortlund makes, and this is taken from Ferguson's text, is that infant mortality was kind of the driving force in the spread of infant baptism. The question of, well, what do we do with our infants who die prior to conversion because they're infants, they can't profess faith, and they started applying baptism in these kind of emergency cases so that forgiveness or salvation might be applied to those infants prior to their death, because they're not going to be able to live to an age where they can make some kind of outward profession of faith clearly for themselves. But some scholarship has, like I said, in the 20th century, starting in the 1920s, started to move toward a view that said, no, this is actually a New Testament practice, and this arises out of an alignment with both those Jewish and those Hellenistic contexts in which the New Testament itself was written. Okay, so there is a well-known debate that happens in the middle of the 20th century over this issue of infant baptism. And Dr. Ortlund did mention this in his video very briefly at the beginning. And this is the debate between two scholars, Joachim Jeremias and Kurt Aland. Now, Joachim Jeremias published a very influential book. It's very small, like I said, on the subject of infant baptism in the early church, which is called Infant Baptism in the First 4 Centuries. Now, the first edition of this book was published in 1938, but the response to this book didn't come out for quite some time. 1958 was the last edition of this book, published in German, and then in 1960, this was published in English, and when it was published in English, it started to get a lot of attention. And so after it got that attention, Kurt Aland responded to Jeremias, and he wrote a book called Did the Early Church Baptize Infants in 1961. And he critiques Jeremias' work. He argues for what was then the older position that there was no evidence for infant baptism until the later 3rd century, second half of the 3rd century. Okay. Jeremias then responded with a second book then to Aland titled The Origins of Infant Baptism in 1962. Now, in recent years, of course, that only leads us to 60 years ago. So the scholarship is somewhat old, and you may say, well, why are you looking at a 60-year-old book? And I still think that the arguments that he lays out really still hold water. I do. So just because it's an older text, that does not mean that it should be neglected. Now, Everett Ferguson has written the most extensive recent treatment of the subject, baptism in the early church, history, theology, and liturgy in the first 5 centuries. There are a few editions of this. The last one was published in 2013. He essentially reiterates the position of Aland and rejects Jeremias' position. Now, Ferguson comes from the Church of Christ, and so the Church of Christ is a group that believes in baptismal regeneration, but also rejects infant baptism, a rather uncommon position to hold in the church. They're really the only significant group that does today. However, that is Tertullian's position, and certainly is a position that shows up within the patristic era. And that essentially is kind of what he sees during this era as well. Now, he doesn't make hard and fast arguments or statements about the practices of infant baptism during that difficult era. We don't have a lot of documentation, but he does argue that there is no, at least definitive evidence that these things were being practiced at that time. Now, I will say it's a very large book, and I have not read the entirety of the book. I've read portions of the book. It's a widely respected text in the field for sure. Okay, well, now let's get into the actual arguments. Now, I'm drawing from both of Jeremias' books here, and so I'm not going to do his original arguments and then present Aland's responses and then his responses to those responses. I'm just going to kind of present as one comprehensive whole through looking at both of those books on these issues, Jeremias' argument. And so we're looking here at the New Testament itself. Now, we're going to look at the oikos formula, these oikos baptisms. Oikos, this term means household. And so as we look throughout the New Testament, we see several examples of individuals being baptized. And when those individuals are baptized, there is a consequent baptism of the household of that person, oikos. And so the question is, when an adult convert is baptized in the New Testament, are their children baptized along with them. So we are not debating whether someone should be instructed in the faith before they are baptized in terms of a new convert. The question is, what happens to the children of the new convert? Do those children receive the sacrament along with the convert? Or is it the case that those children must reach a certain age in which they are then to be catechized, and then they can make a profession of faith themselves at some point, and then they would be baptized into the faith as well? So what exactly does the New Testament tell us? Well, the New Testament does not present some kind of definitive answer. And when I say that, I don't mean that we can't find an answer in the New Testament, because I think we can. But what I mean is that we can't find one singular verse or set of verses or passages that explicitly states one of the following. Right? We don't have a passage that says that an individual was baptized and their infants were also baptized with them. We don't have an example that clearly specifies there was an infant in the family that was baptized. Okay. We also don't have any illustrations or exhortations in the New Testament to Christian converts to make sure that their kids convert at some point in life so that they can later be baptized. We simply don't see either of those things explicitly spelled out. Again, that doesn't mean we can't find an answer in the New Testament, but it does mean that we don't have some kind of singular example. We don't have any text in the New Testament that speaks specifically to the issue of how a Christian should look at their children in relation to baptism in one way or another. So, what do we do then? Well, there is a series of baptisms in the text of the New Testament that we are told are household baptisms. And so we have one in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 16, where Paul is talking about baptism, and he's talking about how there are divisions in the Corinthian church, and some people are saying, I follow Paul, and they're saying, I follow Apollos. And in light of that, Paul says, well, I'm thankful I didn't baptize, anybody except for the household of Stephanas. I didn't, because then people can't claim, Paul is my savior because I was baptized into Paul. But what that does tell us is that the one baptism that is mentioned specifically by Paul in 1 Corinthians is a household baptism. Okay, then throughout the book of Acts, we have several examples of household baptisms. We are told that Lydia is baptized in Acts chapter 16, verse 15, and her household is baptized along with her. This is a very abbreviated text, so we don't have a lot of extensive information about this. The Philippian jailer believes, and his household is baptized along with him, and they all rejoice together, Acts 16:33. Then we have Crispus, the head of the synagogue. He is baptized in Corinth along with his household as well. This is in Acts 18, verse 8. And then we have Cornelius, and Cornelius is, if you remember, the one who gets this vision that he is going to meet Peter, and Cornelius is told in this vision that he will be saved and his household, Acts 11:14. So we have this, you and your household, they and their household were baptized. So this formula is pretty extensive throughout these examples in the book of Acts and then in 1 Corinthians. Nowhere do we see an example of someone who we know has children and the children are not baptized, or it's not mentioned that the children are baptized. Every time that there is a household that we know of, the household is baptized as a whole. So a lot of people, when they look at this argument, want to say, well, we don't actually know if they were definitely infants in those households. We don't even know if there were children. Perhaps they were all just servants, or perhaps the children were older and they made a decision for themselves. And so what I want to say is, when we're making an argument for infant baptism out of these passages, the point is not that we definitively know that this person had an infant and the infant was baptized. No, the point that we're trying to make is this is the principle that is being demonstrated throughout the New Testament, that when someone is baptized, the household of that person is baptized along with them. And so whether there specifically are infants in these instances isn't really the point. The point is the general principle that when you are baptized, the household is also baptized at conversion as well. And this plays out as an extension of themes of the Old Testament. All right, so then we have the question, who is included in an oikos? who is included in a household? So what exactly is a household in the New Testament? Because we have all these household baptisms. And so this is an important question, because perhaps, a household is just somebody with their servants who are part of the household. Or perhaps a household is a husband and wife. Now, what is a household? Well, a household certainly would have included a wife and children. And we'll look at some examples of that, which is quite evident. It is true that servants or slaves who lived in a home, we're not talking about daytime workers, but those who lived in a home were often included within a household as well. So it could have also included somebody's servants if that individual had servants, as well as children. Now, in 3 of the instances of household baptisms, it's clarified that all of the household was baptized. And so we see these phrases like the whole house. You'll see a translator, or all of the household. And those kinds of phrases are actually found quite a bit throughout the Old Testament as well. But it's making the point that it's not just that, say, the wife was baptized when a husband became a Christian, or a widow became a Christian and her one child got baptized and the others didn't. So there's a point that Luke is making by saying that the whole household, all of the household, every person in the household was baptized. Now, some have made the argument that perhaps these households maybe didn't include children really at all. Perhaps these were mere instances of servants or slaves being part of the house. Now, it's pretty unlikely that Lydia or the head of a prison or Cornelius would have been wealthy enough to have some large number of servants. So we're talking about all of the household. That does imply certainly more than one. And so this most likely is referring to the children of those individuals. Now, Lydia, it's often been assumed that she was a widow and had children, because she's not, there's no husband mentioned, but we don't definitively know for sure. There's no list of names or something like that we see of who exactly is in these households. Now, if households are referring to slaves or servants rather than children, say if some of these instances, like one has been proposed, that Lydia perhaps simply was not married and did not have any kids, and that her household was simply her, say, female servants. Well, if it was the case that there was a practice then, a common practice of someone being converted and then their servants being baptized with them, this doesn't really seem to fit with other early Christian testimonies that we have. Because if this was the case like with Lydia, or in all of these examples, say it was, well, the servants often just converted with the convert, the master of the house. Well, we have examples, for example, Philemon, in the book of Philemon, we have Philemon and Onesimus, where clearly the slave was not converted along with the master of the slave. That's the whole point. That's what the book is about, how the slave had now converted after running away, and Paul is urging him to go back. Further, Aristides mentions in his apology that the early Christians encouraged their slaves to convert, not that they considered them automatically converted. So that's kind of interesting here, that we do have some early Christian testimony to how Christians viewed the servants in their households. And we actually have more testimony there than we have of how Christians viewed their children from that particular era. So for whatever reason, this is brought up. So the point is that it is not the assumption within these early Christian communities that the servants would necessarily convert with the master, because there was a kind of pleading to the servants that they too might convert. So the language of households, though, does have a lot of Old Testament precedent. And so when we're talking about households, there is a lot that we can say about what the Old Testament has to say about households. Now, Jeremias has a ton of these citations, actually, in both volumes, so there's a lot more we can go through. But here are just some examples to show that households include children, or Jeremias' argument is going to be that it primarily refers to children. So Saul threatens Ahimelech that his whole house might die. Well, the actual events here that are prophesied include the death of infants. So 1 Samuel 22, 16 through 19. So in this instance, household certainly includes infants. Second example here from Genesis chapter 45. Pharaoh gives permission for Joseph's household to come to Egypt, which includes those who were not yet able to walk because they were infants. Genesis 45, 18 through 19. Elkanah traveled with his whole household in order to make sacrifices. That's his children. 1 Samuel 1:21. Now, we have the example of Abraham and circumcision. Abraham's children who received circumcision are referred to as his house or his household. Genesis 17:23, one example of that. Jeremiah cites several other instances of this same phrase, he and his house, bayit, in the where that is used in the Old Testament. You could even think of like the very famous passage, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, that you see from Joshua, in the book of Joshua. And so we have this phrase used repeatedly in the Old Testament, and yes, in the Greek Septuagint, you do often see this identified with that same word, oikos. We have bayit in the Hebrew text here. But we have this phrase that's used repeatedly, someone and their house, and their household. And so there is this deep connection between the individual and then the household, which largely includes the family. All right. The actions of the father often have a consequence for the whole household. And this is something that I think as modern people we just miss when we're reading the New Testament. We tend to think about conversion as an individual matter. And we think about an individual having a particular experience. And within that particular conversion experience, the individual makes a decision for themselves that they are going to follow Christ. Or, if you're speaking, of course, in a Calvinistic context, it might not be you making that decision, but God is electing you as a particular individual and you have a conversion experience. And then your faith is something that particularly belongs to you, but you want to pass on to your children, but it doesn't particularly belong to them until they have some kind of particular type of conversion experience. But an ancient mindset doesn't really function in that same way. And so we have so many instances where somebody is faithful and they are blessed and their family is blessed, or somebody is not faithful and they are cursed and their family is cursed. We even see this in the Ten Commandments, where we have the promises and the warnings. We talk about generations being blessed or generations being cursed. And so what one individual in the family does is going to affect the rest of the household, the rest of the family, particularly children, and I think in an even greater way than we have with something like household servants. And so we have several examples of this in Scripture. Genesis 7:1, 1 Samuel 27:3, Jeremiah 38:17, Numbers 16:27. You can look up all those texts yourself. Probably, maybe the most obvious example of this that's most familiar to a lot of people would be just Noah. Think about Noah and his family. And so Noah is the one that believes in the Lord, and Noah is the one that is faithful in the midst of a world of absolute corruption. And Noah is saved. Because of his faith, God calls him to build the ark, and not only is he saved, but his family members are saved with him. 8 in all are saved because of the faith of Noah. And Jeremiah is going to argue that this use of household language that is used in the book of Acts is particular. It's not just common Greco-Roman terminology to refer to someone's family, but he's saying that it is specifically taken from the Old Testament, and it is specifically taken from the cultic language of the Old Testament. Now, by cultic, when scholars use that term cultic, don't think of cult or occult. Cultic just meaning related to worship, right? So saying that this is language related to worship, specifically circumcision, so that when someone is circumcised, the household is circumcised as well, right? So Abraham is circumcised and he circumcises his household. When somebody converts to Judaism, they are circumcised and the household is circumcised. So he's saying that this is intentional when Paul and then Luke use this language about households, that it is drawn explicitly from the Old Testament. Cultic language. Okay, there's a really good article on this subject of oikos baptisms that was collected in a multi-author collection of essays on infant baptism. I can't remember the exact name of the essay, but it was by one of my undergrad professors at Geneva College, Jonathan Watt. He has a really good article, very helpful. He was my Greek professor. I learned Greek from him on this subject of oikos baptisms. So I can't remember the name of the book or the article, but if you look up oikos baptisms, Jonathan Watt, W-A-T-T, you should be able to find that. A very helpful article, I think, on this issue. If you want to see something a little more recent, certainly more recent than 1960. Okay. Now, let's think about how then the New Testament speaks about baptism in relation to the Old Testament. So the question here, I'm not making a systematic theological or dogmatic argument for infant baptism. I've done that in plenty of places. I'm simply asking the question throughout this talk, does it appear to be the case that the New Testament authors themselves, in the era of the New Testament, does it appear to be the case that those who wrote these texts, these early Christians, practiced infant baptism? And so how were they thinking about baptism is the question I'm really asking here today. So let's look at the New Testament citations of Old Testament types of baptism. So New Testament citations of Old Testament types or pictures of baptism. So there are several times in the New Testament where there is a connection made between the sacrament of holy baptism and some kind of rite in the Old Covenant or the Old Testament. So some of these are I think, pretty explicit. So we have to ask the question, well, do these always include households, and do they include specifically children? And the answer is yes, they do. So first one here is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. St. Paul is making all of these connections in this particular passage with the sacraments, and both sacraments, right, about baptism and the Lord's Supper, how these are fulfillments of things that were pictured in the Old Covenant. And in the Old Covenant, the Israelites passed through the Red Sea, which is a kind of baptism, and then they partook of the spiritual rock where God miraculously gives water in the desert, and that is their spiritual drink, and they had spiritual food, which is manna. This is all a type or picture of Holy Communion. So we have this typology of the sacraments in the Old Testament that are then fulfilled in the New Testament. So this one is, again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that the Israelites were baptized into Moses. Now, that's a really interesting phrase, but it says they're baptized into Moses in the same way that now Christians are baptized into Christ. So, did that include households, this baptism, this crossing of the Red Sea? Well, yeah, it was the parents who chose to follow Moses into the wilderness. I mean, they had to make a choice, right? But the families came with them. It wasn't that if every individual had to decide if they were going to cross the Red Sea by themselves. No, it was a group of households, and it certainly included infants who were crossing the Red Sea. So this experience of redemption that was the crossing of the Red Sea, which is a baptism into Moses, the blessings of that baptism were given to the children who were taken or carried across the Red Sea. And so the blessings of the baptism were given not just to those who made some kind of conscious choice or had a conscious experience, but to all those who passed through the Red Sea. Okay, second example that we see in the New Testament is the flood. So this comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, where he says that Noah and his family were saved through water, which is a type of baptism which now saves us, or now saves you, technically. So there's some parallel between what happens with Noah and the flood and then what happens to us in baptism. Now, as I mentioned before, it's Noah who's commended for his faith, but through Noah's faith, his whole household, his whole family partook of the redemption that Noah received. The whole family was saved through water. And 2 Peter even says, there were 8 souls in all. So just to make the point further that there are 8 of them. They all received the blessing of being delivered from God's judgment on the earth along with Noah. So second example that's explicit in the New Testament of baptism in the Old Testament includes a household, including children, the children of Noah. Okay, and then we have a third reference, which is in Colossians chapter 2, verse 11. This is one that's very well known within the context of arguments for infant baptism, especially within a more Reformed context, and that is that baptism is referred to as a circumcision. So we're told that baptism is the circumcision of Christ, Colossians 2:11. Now, did that include households? Of course it included households. We explicitly know that those who received circumcision in the Old Testament were, unless they were an adult convert, they were infants. On the 8th day, they were circumcised. Okay, then we have a reference to baptism and really all of the events of Pentecost. This is in Acts chapter 2, as being a fulfillment of a prophecy in the prophet Joel, chapter 2. And this prophecy includes sons and daughters, first thing mentioned, young men, old men, and servants. And so the prophecy of Pentecost that is in the book of Joel includes households. So what we have here is every single example that we have in the New Testament, where it cites an example in the Old Testament of baptism, whether it's a prophecy of baptism or it is some kind of typological event that prefigures baptism, every single one of them includes households, including children, all of them. And so you see how, because this principle is here all over the Old Testament, that when the New Testament speaks about households, all of this is in the background. When you read all of this together and you read about households being baptized, of course you're going to make this connection to say, yes, that the children of those who enter into Christ, who are baptized, who profess faith, of course they're going to share in those blessings together. That's the way that it's always been. Now, another point that, and this is one that I've made over and over and over again on this issue, I think this is a decisive point. I don't think this is a minor point. I think this is decisive. And that is that New Testament fulfillments of Old Testament types are always more inclusive, every single time. They're always greater, and they're always greater not just in their efficacy, which is true, but they're also greater in terms of who is included within them. And so we have then this principle all over the place, that things like, well, it used to be that circumcision, if we're taking one example, of course, of a type of baptism, it's not the only one, well, that was only for males. Well, now baptism is for males and females, right? There is neither male nor female. Paul's talking about baptism in that particular text in Galatians. So we're all united in baptism. Well, God's covenant with Moses was a covenant for the Israelites. Well, the new covenant is greater because it is a covenant with all people from all nations, not just the nation of Israel. And so this is the entire pattern of the Old to the New Testament, is from more restrictive to more universal. And so I think it would be inconceivable that baptism, the Christian sacrament, that which brings you into the church, brings you into Christ, would now be restrictive in a way that none of the Old Testament types of baptism were. It's exactly the opposite of the direction that things move from old to new. And it seems to me that if the apostles believed that there was some massive shift here, or there was some incongruity here, that would have to be spelled out somewhere, and it simply never is. All right. Now, I want to look here at a couple just early definitions of this oikos word, household. And so we have a couple examples of how early Christians were thinking about households. The first of these is from the Shepherd of Hermas. This is a very early Christian work and a really popular Christian work, and one that is really weird. So it was very popular at the time. I think for the modern reader, including myself, just don't understand why it was as popular as it was. But for whatever reason, it spoke to the ancient mind, even though it doesn't speak to the modern one very well. It's a weird book. It's a series of visions, and at least the first section is a series of visions. But in the first vision, chapter 3, there is a calling out of sin throughout these visions, and largely the sins include how you're treating or raising your children. There's more than that, but that's part of what's going on, at least here in this particular context. And so the Shepherd of Hermas says this: "But God is not angry with you on account of this, but that you may convert your house, which have committed iniquity against the Lord and against you, their parents." And although you love your sons, yet did you not warn your house, but permitted them to be terribly corrupted? On this account is the Lord angry with you, but he will heal all the evils which have been done in your house. And so this is explicit that this means children. Your household is your children. And throughout these sections of prophecies, there are some other references here as well that make it pretty clear that he's just talking about children. And so this, I think, reinforces Jeremias' point that household, though, yes, it can refer to servants, often, particularly, is really referring to children. And so that certainly seems to be the way that Hermas is interpreting this. Then we have just a brief mention of this in Ignatius, 2nd century, Ignatius' Epistle to the Smyrnians. He says, I salute the families of my brethren with their wives and children. So households, families include wives and children. They're singled out, not servants. And so I'm pretty compelled by this. It seems to me, at least looking at the Old Testament examples and how the Septuagint uses this phrase oikos, and these other early Christian examples, I'm pretty compelled by the argument that says that while servants are occasionally identified with a household has a special reference to children. And so I think that that is likely the case in the book of Acts. Now, we also have to think about the relationship between a father and children in the ancient world, which is very different from the way that a father relates to children in the contemporary world, in the modern world. In the ancient world, the faith of the father as the head of the household was definitive for the faith of the family. Now, it's not always the father, because we do have examples of someone like Lydia. If you are a woman and you're a widow and you have children, then the woman would be the head of the household, and the same kind of thing would work with the mother. And we have an example of this in Acts chapter 16, verses 30 through 34. Dr. Ortlund brought this up in his video, and I just don't agree with the way that he's reading this text, but let's see what it says. And he brought them out and said, Sirs, what must I, singular here, do to be saved? So then they said, believe, singular, so this is interesting, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. So the believe is singular, but then the and your household is plural. So you singular believe, your whole household will be saved. Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all who were in his house. Okay, so him and then the house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes. Immediately he and all his family were baptized. Now when he had brought them into his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all his household. And so the way that this is constructed is interesting, because he's the one who's commanded to believe, but there's basically the assumption that you believe, your household does too. You believe and your whole house is going to be saved. And then at the end we're told that he believed in God with all his household. So the point is, there is an assumption here that if the father believes, the household believes. And what Dr. Ortlund does in his videos, he talks about household conversions. Well, this isn't an example of infant baptism. This is an example of household conversion. Well, what do you mean by that? Because I would say that infant baptisms are a household conversion. And so he seems to put these things against each other. And I don't think it's the case that what he's talking about here in this text is a personal conversion experience. I don't think that what he's saying is everyone in the household, because this is that all of his household language that we talked about. I don't think it necessarily means that everybody had a particular individual conversion experience that just so happened to be at the same time. But for many Christian families, or perhaps most Christian families, it's going to be the case that one person believes and then tries to pray for the others in hopes that they eventually believe, and eventually, hopefully, they'll have their conversion experience, and then they will get baptized when they have that experience. No, I think the point is the belief is tied to the baptism and the faith of the Father. The whole point is the Father believes, says, we're Christians now, everyone gets baptized, and that's belief. I think that's the point, is it is a household conversion, but that's what infant baptism is a household conversion. So that you have one that chooses for the household, and they're all Christians now. Okay. And this is what happens every time. And so it's the assumption that if the parent converts, the whole household converts. That's the assumption in the New Testament. That's the default. And so I don't think they're thinking about conversion in the way that contemporary evangelicals are thinking about conversion, because I don't think they're talking about just some kind of personal, heartfelt experience, because that's not the case. Like it's not the case that if you look at how your average kind of Baptist evangelical looks at a conversion of a household. I mean, it's usually going to be that everybody's got to have their own kind of personal decision for Christ. Obviously, I know Dr. Ortlund's Reformed. He's not thinking in that synergistic terms, but I think that's how how people tend to think of it. How often is that every single person has a conversion at the same time? Pretty much never. Maybe not like it's an impossibility. I'm sure there are examples of that, but the way that they're thinking about conversion isn't such that it makes that much sense for there to just be entire households that are all converted at the same time, when you're thinking just this interpersonal conversion experience. So I don't think that's what's going on. Baptism is the conversion. That's the point. Okay. Now, there is a kind of precedent for this as well, even outside of baptism, that we find in the New Testament. That, again, it's just a reiteration of the Old Testament principle that what the father does then affects the whole household. And that is in John chapter 4, we have the nobleman who comes to Jesus and he asks that his son would be healed. And this then leads to the healing of the son and the faith of the household. These are all tied together so that he basically believes in some way for his son. Jesus, because of his faith, blesses the household, and then the household believes in response. And this is that same kind of working where the head of the household converts, finds healing from Jesus, and then everybody's healed from Jesus, through Jesus, together. Then we have this other related issue, which is proselyte baptisms. Okay, why is this relevant before I jump into this? Proselyte baptisms were baptisms that existed within ancient Judaism that were baptisms of Gentile converts to Judaism, and these baptisms included infants and children. And so the question that we have to ask with these proselyte baptisms is, were these happening in the first century? Because if they were happening during the time of the New Testament, and if John's baptism was within the context of proselyte baptisms, then this just, reiterates that infants were brought into baptism in Judaism in this context, so that when they're thinking about baptism in the New Testament, especially talking about households and this kind of thing, it was done in a context where they were already used to infant baptism. They already believed in infant baptism. And so this is a reiteration of something that's already going on in some way. Okay, so there is some debate about the dating of the practice. Now, I've heard some Reformed Baptists in recent times make arguments that there's no evidence whatsoever that proselyte baptisms were actually practiced during the time of the New Testament, but developed after the New Testament. Now, let me say this. Even if it was the case, I don't think it is, even if it is the case that proselyte baptisms began in the 2nd century, and those baptisms included infants, what that would show you even then was something about the ancient worldview and the ancient Jewish worldview, that when they are thinking about conversions, they are thinking about children and infants as well. So even if it wasn't practiced in the New Testament times, it would be an illustration of the way that people in that era, in a Jewish context, think about conversions in relation to children. So it's still relevant. But I'm going to say that no, I think that there is significant evidence that proselyte baptisms were occurring in the 1st century. Now, there was a debate about this issue between the Shammai and the Hillel schools. And so you have these different rabbinical schools, and there are all sorts of debates between the looser school and the stricter school in ancient Judaism. But and the details of this don't really matter. The point is that this was an issue that was debated, and this is referenced, this debate or this distinction between these two schools on the issue of proselyte baptisms is referenced in Mishnah, Pesachim 8:8 and Mishnah Eduyat 5:2. These are both late 2nd century texts. The Mishnah Eduyat identifies 6 ways in which Shammai was lenient and Hillel was more strict. So there's a list of these 6 things, and one of those is the amount of time a proselyte convert must wait between their baptism and then the eating of the Passover meal. Now, so just because the documents were written in the 2nd century that doesn't mean that they're only referring to practices that had just developed in the 2nd century. They're talking about rabbinic schools that precede the fall of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so these are things that had been passed on orally, and perhaps in writing somewhere, in something that we don't have, but at least orally, the traditions of these rabbis had been passed on to their students. And so it's the understanding that this proselyte baptism thing was so prominent even in the 1st century that you have debates about exactly how it is to be done in relation to when one takes the Passover. It is mentioned, the practice of proselyte baptism is mentioned in Book 4 of the Sibylline Oracles. And now this is 80 AD when this portion of the Sibylline Oracles was written, and it's multi-author text that developed over some period of time. So, and there are some scholars, to be clear, that also argue that the oracles are actually Christian texts rather than Jewish ones. That's not the majority opinion, but that opinion does exist. Just to kind of cover all my bases, I just kind of have to say that. Looking at the text, and you can find translations of these online, they certainly sounds Jewish. Does not sound Christian. This practice of proselyte baptism is also mentioned by Epictetus in his Discourses, chapter 2, 9, 19 through 21. Now, the dating of this, the saying somewhere between 94 and 108. Those are the dates, at least, that I could find online. Now, his student wrote down the teachings, and so they're written down in 108, but these are teachings then, of course, that preceded him, because he's writing down the teachings of his teacher, not his own ideas, and so it precedes it. So this is just evidence of very end of the 1st century. The proselyte baptism certainly seemed to be occurring. Okay, so other evidence for the dating of proselyte baptism being early. There's a story of a proselyte, Valeria, who was baptized along with her slaves. So there are slaves here involved within this baptism as well, not only children. And that is sometime prior to the Bar Kokhba revolt in Jerusalem, which is 135 AD. An alternate theory of origins of this practice contends that the Jewish people were borrowing from Christian baptism. And so essentially Christians were practicing Trinitarian baptism, or whatever kind of baptism they were practicing, say John's baptism before that, and that it was kind of adopted as a Jewish practice and kind of Judaized and became what we know now as proselyte baptisms. Now, this is highly unlikely because after the rise of Christianity, the Jewish self-definition is often done in contrast to Christianity. So oftentimes Judaism really tries to distinguish itself more, especially after the destruction of the temple at 70 AD, really tries to distinguish itself from Christianity very strongly. And so this would be an anomaly if it went the other way. If the Jews were borrowing a practice from Christianity and then making it more Hebraic or something. So usually it's kind of the other way around. Now, there is a possible reference to this practice in the book, The 12 Patriarchs, and Jeremias argues very strongly in favor of this being a reference to proselyte baptisms. It's not like that clear, so it may not be, but there's at least a relatively strong case to be made that this is a reference to proselyte baptisms. Now, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs has supposedly sayings that were said by each of the 12 patriarchs. This one is in the section on Levi, 14:6. It's dated somewhere between late 2nd century BC, early 1st century AD. Now, we know at least portions of this text, or some form of this text, was written around 100 BC at least, because we have at least selections of it in the Qumran scrolls. But there are Christian interpolations in later manuscripts, but that's not evident in this particular portion of the text. So let's talk about the origins of the practice. Where did this come from? Well, it's not explicitly biblical, and what I mean by that is there's no biblical command for Gentile converts to Judaism to be baptized or receive any kind of baptism. What Jeremias argues is that there is this move that occurs within Judaism from seeing the Gentiles as really not capable of becoming ceremonially unclean because they're not under the law in the first place. So uncleanness has to do with your relationship to the law, and only the Jewish people were given the Mosaic law, the Mosaic administration, and therefore only the Jewish people could become ceremonially unclean. It uniquely applies to them because of their redemptive historical circumstance. And the Gentiles, they're not under the law anyway, so the whole idea of ceremonial uncleanness doesn't really relate to the Gentiles. And so Jeremias is going to argue that there is this shift from that view to one which sees the Gentiles as unclean, meaning personally unclean. They are unclean because they are Gentiles. This is seen in a story that's told about the priest Simeon, the son of Camathos, circa 17 to 18, who supposedly could not perform his priestly duties because he was spit on by a Gentile. The New Testament, according to Jeremias, presupposes this view of personal Gentile uncleanness. So he's saying that this development clearly happened prior to the writing of the New Testament, because in the New Testament, the Jewish people are presupposing that this is the case, that Gentiles are unclean. Now, this idea of Gentile personal uncleanness is where the practice of proselyte baptism comes from, because anytime something is ritually unclean, there is some kind of ritual to make the unclean clean. We have this all throughout the Mosaic law, that if somebody is unclean, is defiled because of this or that, there is a very particular ritual and rites or series of rites that the individual has to go through to then become ceremonially clean once again. However, there is no explicit ritual to wash away the uncleanness of being a Gentile in the Mosaic administration. And so therefore, this practice of proselyte baptism develops in order to make a way for unclean Gentiles to then become clean. Now, let's talk about the connection then between this proselyte baptism within Judaism and then what is the practice of New Testament Christian baptism. Well, the language to baptize is used only within Jewish context. You don't really see this kind of language within Hellenistic context. So it's pretty clear that there is an Old Testament Jewish root to what is being said in the New Testament. I don't think it's just proselyte baptisms, to be clear. I think that there are a whole host of God-given baptisms that are the various ceremonial washings of the Old Testament. There was a form of catechesis that was part of proselyte baptism, which at least one rabbi cites 5 different elements of the kind of instruction, including things like the sincerity of the one converting or the commandments of God. So there was this catechetical instruction that needed to happen prior to the proselyte baptism. There is, at times, a confession of sin that we see required before a proselyte baptism. Hillelites argue that the people of Israel received a baptism at Sinai, and they would say that there must have been a baptism because there's this sprinkling of blood, which only occurs after a washing, and so they would say, well, they must have been baptized, even though it's not recorded in the text itself, at Sinai, and they were baptized into Moses. That's at least one of the ways to interpret this, and that the Gentile converts, in their baptisms, they're brought into the Mosaic covenant. So they receive something that the Israelites received. So it's a bringing into the covenant with Moses, which Paul may have had in view when he uses this language about being baptized into Moses in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1. At this proselyte baptism, there was language of the baptized being like a newborn child or a new creation. And sometimes the proselyte was given a new name at the moment of their baptism. Now, when I say all of those things, it becomes pretty evident that there are some pretty strong parallels between that and Christian baptism. Catechesis, confession of sins, this being brought into events of redemptive history through this act, being brought into a covenant, they're brought into the Mosaic covenant, we think of the new covenant in baptism, or that the one who is proselyte who is baptized in some way like a newborn child, right, being born again by water and the Spirit, John chapter 3. Clear parallels here. And the baptized is given a new name. They have a new identity. And there are practices of Christian baptisms where one is given a new name. Okay. Then we have the question of the subjects of proselyte baptism. So when a Gentile converted, all children born after the parents' conversion was considered clean or Jewish. Infants who were not yet born while a mother converted did not need to receive baptism because it was said that they already kind of partook of the mother's washing. But those whose mother converted afterward did have to do that. They actually have like a cutoff age of 3 years. A child of unknown origin was to be baptized in case they were of Gentile descent. If the child was what they call a foundling, basically an orphan, and you don't know who the parents are. And if you didn't know that child was Jewish and they were in a Jewish community, they would receive a baptism. So there's infant baptism. That children were converted with the parents was a given in rabbinic sources. It's never argued for, but it is assumed. That, of course, if one converts to Judaism, the whole family converts. Of course, that's the way it is. And it does seem that that is the way that the Jewish people are functioning. And so likely, that's exactly how they would have functioned at the time of the New Testament as well. Okay, final slide here. So Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, verses 38 through 39. Now, this is the text where Peter's preaching at Pentecost, and at the end of this sermon, Peter calls the people of Israel to take action. They were told that they're cut to the heart, the listeners, meaning they're feeling very guilty about what they've done. They look at each other and say, brothers, what must we do? And then Peter responds and tells them what they must do about this dilemma that the Messiah had been killed. And he says to them, repent and let every one of you be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, for the promise is to you and to your children and to all who are afar off, as many as the Lord our God will call. Okay, the phrase that stands out here, of course, is and your children. And so there are basically two interpretations of this text that are taken. Now, one, and this is those who argue against infant baptism in this text, are going to say, well, the children that are being talked about here are descendants. And so what Peter is saying here is that the promise is not only for you, but it's for your future descendants, for generations after you. And those are all the generations who call upon the Lord, right? So, or who the Lord will call. So whoever the Lord calls in your future generations. The second interpretation of this text, just the one that I take, is that this is about immediate children. It is what it sounds like. It's saying that you and the children that you have right now, not just your future descendants. So this is about immediate children, i.e. households. And my argument is that this is just part of the literary structure of the book of Acts. And so Pentecost is a precursor to everything else that happens in the book of Acts, right? So Pentecost is, and before this you have this kind of prologue where you have the ascension of Jesus and the instructions that are given to the disciples. But the chapter 2 is really the kind of thesis, the beginning point of the book of Acts. And I said thesis because it also tells you what the whole book is about. So everything that is here present at Pentecost is fulfilled in the rest of the book. And so this isn't just an isolated sermon. This is Peter saying what's happening here. He's saying that the prophecies of Joel are being fulfilled right now, and you're going to see these prophecies fulfilled. And Luke is saying, here's where the prophecies are fulfilled. I'm going to show you how God did what he said he was going to do here, and he does it throughout the book. So think about this, right? So he says that, well, this is also for those who are far off, as many as the Lord our God will call. Now, is he really speaking about, is this a prophecy about the modern missionary movement? Well, it certainly applies to that. But is that what Peter is really trying to do? Or is that what Luke is trying to do in citing Peter here? No, I think the point is everyone who's at Pentecost is a Jew. And so those who are gathered together at Pentecost are Jews who live in other countries, but they're Jews. And they live in different places, but they come together in Jerusalem for the Jewish Feast of Pentecost. So they're Jewish people. They're not Gentiles. And he's saying that the promise is not just for you, but it's also for those who are far off. In other words, the Gentiles, which is fulfilled in the book of Acts. So we have these other Pentecosts that happen. We have this Pentecost. We have the Samaritan Pentecost. Samaritans are kind of this halfway point between Jews and Gentiles. And then we have the Gentile Pentecost. So we say the Spirit is sent to you and the Spirit is sent to those who are far off. Right, so that's the point. We see this fulfilled in the book of Acts, immediately fulfilled, so that the word spreads, the Spirit moves from here to there. Okay, so we have other Pentecosts happening for those who are far off, and this is connected to that fulfillment of that other phrase, you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. Right? You receive the gift of the Holy Spirit is given to them too. which is all included in this thing that is the promise, which is the promises for you and your children and those who are far off. So the promise includes the Holy Spirit and the forgiveness of sins. So the Holy Spirit is given to those who are far off with these other Pentecosts that happen. Then we have the household baptisms, which are the fulfillment of you and your children. And those who are far off, meaning those who are far off and their children too. So we see that this is fulfilled in the book of Acts too. So you see that the Spirit comes, people are baptized, people are far off are baptized, Gentiles are baptized, and people are baptized with their children. That's all fulfilled throughout this book. So it's fulfilled in the household baptisms. So as we see, they're baptized in their household. That's a fulfillment of Acts chapter 2. And those household baptisms, again, are for the remission of sins, or be baptized and wash away your sins. And so these promises are fulfilled in the rest of the book of Acts, which is in household baptisms. Now, remember everything that I just said about proselyte baptisms, about the Old Testament context of this phraseology, about the Old Testament types of baptism, which all include households. Keep all of this in mind. This is all in the mind of a first century Jew. Now think about how a first century Jew, with those presuppositions in mind, that context in mind, would hear this promise for you and your children. And so this is all familiar to them. Of course they're going to interpret this as their actual children, not many descendants who may happen to have a conversion experience many years later. This is, again, common Old Testament phraseology, you and your house, or me and my house. It means, me and my children, immediate children. Again, this text is referencing Joel, which specifically identifies members of the household: children, young men, old men, servants. The point is, it's people of all ages. Now, a response to this that's sometimes given is, well, young men, the children are going to prophesy and dream dreams, so if they're not old enough to prophesy, they're not old enough to dream dreams, then the infants don't kind of count in this prophecy or something. I think that's missing the whole point. The whole point of Joel's prophecy is it's everybody. And so he's just outlining young men, old men, your servants in your house, everybody. That's the point. It's not to say that, well, every single one of them has to do X, Y, or Z. They all have to have the mental capacity to have visions or something. It's missing the entire point of the text. So that's a summary of the evidence in the New Testament here. There are passages I didn't look at, but plenty of passages I didn't look at. But I'm just trying to look at some of the, especially kind of honing on that household oikos baptism and what that means in its context, because I do think that it is strong. There is strong argument, there is strong evidence for the practice of oikos baptism, household baptism, which would have included all the children in the household, including infants. And so I think we do have evidence for that practice within the New Testament itself. Let me know if you'd like me to do more of this. There's a lot more I could do, more in the New Testament, and then I could go through that second century evidence and what we have, and grave inscriptions and all sorts of other things as well. So hope you found this useful. Make sure you like, make sure you comment, make sure you subscribe. Any of those things help with the algorithm here. And make sure you subscribe on your podcast app if you haven't already, as well as on YouTube. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.